created by cable in 1979 and brought to you today by your television provider. The House voted to remove the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment nearly 48 years after Congress passed it. Two previous deadlines had already passed without enough states agreeing to amend the Constitution. Here's today's hour-and-a-half-long floor debate on why members are bringing up the issue now.
This is long overdue legislation to ensure that the Equal Rights Amendment can finally become the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This year, we will celebrate the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote. Despite the century that has elapsed, our Constitution still does not recognize or guarantee full equal protection of the law for women and gender minorities. But H.J. Res. 79 would bring us one step closer. The resolution removes the previous deadline Congress set for ratifying the ERA and will therefore ensure that recent ratifications by Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia are given full effect. The ERA offers a basic and fundamental guarantee. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. Very simple. In the years since it was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate, we have made great strides to secure that equality, including through existing case law decided under the 14th Amendment. The ERA would enshrine those principles and take the final critical step of ensuring that laws disadvantaging women and gender minorities are subject to the most rigorous form of constitutional scrutiny. In recent years, we have seen a series of breakthroughs for women's rights and gender equality. We have seen millions of women march in support of their rights and dignity as equal citizens. Through the Me Too movement, we have had long overdue and sometimes painful conversations about the violence and harassment that women and gender minorities experience, whether in the workplace, at home, or in schools and universities. We have seen women get elected to Congress in record numbers, and just weeks ago, Virginia became the necessary 38th and last necessary state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. We are on the brink of making history, and no deadline should stand in the way. The Constitution itself places no deadlines on the process for ratifying constitutional amendments, making it doubtful whether Congress had the authority to impose such a deadline in the first place. But if it had such authority, then Congress clearly also has the authority to remove any deadline that it previously chose to set. I want to thank Representative Jackie Speer for introducing this resolution, which takes that important step. This resolution will ensure, at long last, that the Equal Rights Amendment, having been proposed by Congress years ago, having now been ratified by 3/4 of the states, can take its rightful place as part of our nation's Constitution. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. 3/4 of the state failed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment by 1979 deadline set by Congress, yet House Democrats are trying to retroactively revive the failed constitutional amendment. Congress does not have the power to do that. Congress set the deadline, it was passed, it did not get approved, and now there is an end run to go around that. The United States Supreme Court recognized this in 1982 when it stated that the issue was moot because the deadline for the ERA ratification expired before the requisite number of states approved it. The next year, the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives, acting on the same understanding, started the entire process of ERA approval over again. But that new ERA also failed to achieve the required 2/3 majority in the House on November the 15th, 1983. But today, in defiance of historical reality and the clear acceptance of the situation by all relevant participants in the original debate, the Democrats have brought forward a resolution that denies the obvious. Now the proponents of this resolution want to convince their base that if both houses of Congress pass this joint resolution and is signed into law in 1972, ERA will become part of the Constitution just because the Democrats control the Virginia state legislature, and their legislature passed the ERA this year. Even current Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she is taking a lot of heat for this, a supporter of the ERA since its beginning, has said just a few months ago, "I hope someday we will start all over again on the ERA, collecting the necessary states to ratify it." And on Monday of this week, Justice Ginsburg said, "The ERA, I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like to see it start over. There's just too much controversy about latecomers, Virginia, long after the deadline passed, plus a number of states have withdrawn their ratification. So if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how do you disregard states that said we changed our minds?" Congress does not have the constitutional authority to retroactively revive the failed constitutional amendment and to be subject to citizens of all 50 states to what may be the current political trends in just one state. The U.S. Supreme Court has already recognized that. Past Democratic leaderships of the House has recognized that. Justice Ginsburg's recognized that. But apparently the current Democratic leadership is intent on rewriting history. And as we have our debate today, I will show, and our speakers will show, what the real intent about this is, and it has nothing to do with equal rights. It has a lot to do with other issues that will be exposed today. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from California, the chief sponsor of this bill, Representative Speer.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his extraordinary leadership on this issue. This is very simple, members. Women want to be equal, and we want it in the Constitution. I am equal on this House floor with all of my male colleagues, but when I walk out, I have fewer rights and protections than them. I rise today because the women of America are done being second-class citizens. We are done being paid less for our work, done being violated with impunity, done being discriminated against for our pregnancies, done being discriminated against simply because we are women. The ERA is about equality. The ERA is about sisterhood, motherhood, survival, dignity, and respect. The world recognizes this. Of the 193 countries in the United Nations, 165 have put this kind of language in their constitutions, but not the United States of America. From the Women's March to the Me Too movement to the Pink Wave, the outrage we've seen among women is because we have been disrespected, devalued, and diminished in our society. And we are fed up. It's no wonder recent votes to ratify the ERA came in 2017, 2018, and 2020, because we want the ERA now. We've waited for almost a century for the ERA. I want to thank my Republican co-sponsors of this resolution, including Congressman Reed, Fitzpatrick, and Van Drew. I know most of you recognize that this is the right thing to do for your wives, daughters, and granddaughters. 94% of Americans already support the ERA. In fact, they're surprised it's not already in the Constitution. Now, some of you will say, just restart the process, but you're the same people that admit you won't vote for it. Some will say, well, women already have equality while they vote against VAWA reauthorization, vote against paycheck fairness, chip away at Title IX. For too long, women have relied on the patchwork quilt of laws and precedents. We've put our lives on the line. We've been forced to take our cases all the way to the Supreme Court, and often there we lose. For my colleagues who think we already have women's equality, talk to Christy Broncala, who was raped by 2 football players at Virginia Tech. She sought justice under the Violence Against Women Act, but the Supreme Court struck down the civil suit provisions, claiming Congress lacked the authority to pass it. Or Lilly Ledbetter, who had to rely on an anonymous note to learn she was paid less than her male colleagues at Goodyear. Or Betty Duke, who was passed over for promotions and paid $10,000 less for her work at Walmart. Or Peggy Young, who was placed on unpaid leave, losing her health insurance while pregnant at UPS. All the while, men were granted the exact same accommodation that she was denied. The ERA is about building the America we want. It's about forming a more perfect union. Because simply put, there can be no expiration date on equality. I urge my colleagues to affirm their support for women's equality and vote for this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Leska.
Gentlewoman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am a woman, so I obviously care and support equal rights for women. But I oppose this bill for 3 reasons. First, the bill is not constitutional. When the ERA originally passed, Congress explicitly set a deadline for ratification. The deadline was in 1979, almost 41 years ago. Only 35 states of the 38 needed had ratified it, then 5 states unratified. So the count's down to 30. Thus, the Equal Rights Amendment was dead. The U.S. Department of Justice issued a legal opinion just last month reiterating that the ER's ratification timeline is expired. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg said, "The deadline passed. I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like it to start over." Secondly, the ERA amendment is not necessary. Women's equality of rights under the law is already recognized in our Constitution in the 5th and 14th Amendment. The ACLU's Women's Rights Director wrote, "It has been clearly understood that the 14th Amendment prohibits discrimination based on sex. Plus, many federal, state, and local laws already prohibit sex discrimination." Third reason I oppose this bill: if ratified, the ERA would be used by pro-abortion groups to undo pro-life legislation and lead to more abortions and taxpayer funding of abortions. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at what pro-abortion groups have done and what they say. In 1998, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the state's ERA required the state to fund abortions. NARAL, Pro-Choice America, which supports abortions, asserted that the ERA would reinforce the constitutional right to abortion and would require judges to strike down anti-abortion laws. In a 2019 letter to House Judiciary Committee, the ACLU stated the Equal Rights Amendment could provide an additional layer of protection against restrictions on abortion. In conclusion, this bill is unconstitutional. The ERA is unnecessary, since constitutional federal, state, and local laws already guarantee equal protections, and the ERA, if ratified, would be used by pro-abortion groups to undo pro-life laws. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Again, the deadline was not part of the amendment. It was a resolution by Congress, and if Congress can set a deadline, it can remove a deadline. I now recognize the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Representative Hoyer, for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, first let me thank Representative Speer, Representative Maloney, and all of those who have been such warriors on this issue for such a long period of time. They are keeping the faith. This constitutional amendment was passed in 1972. To be specific, in the early part of 1972. I was a member of the Maryland State Senate in 1972, and I had the honor of shortly after, in the late spring of 1972, just months after the ERA had been passed, of voting to ratify that. Now, the previous speaker said that only 35 states, that's 70% of the states, ratified that in a timely fashion. Timely in the sense that we set in a resolution, as the chairman pointed out, a date. 70% of the states of this nation. Now, it needed 3 more states. It has now received 3 more states. So I've been an advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment for essentially 4 decades, actually longer. I will be proud to vote for it today. Just a few months, as I said, after Congress adopted the ERA, Maryland voted for ratification. I thought that it was long overdue even then in 1972. Here we are, some 48 years later, and it still is. Our founders declared all men are created equal in their Declaration of Independence. Surely, no founder, if they were writing that document today, would have said men when men meant white, property-owning men. Surely they would not have written that. Surely none of us would have supported that. Since the very beginning, Americans have been taking steps, therefore, to define that in a more expansive, inclusive term representing our universal values. We amended the Constitution to ensure African Americans and women could not be denied the right to vote. Took a long time. Particularly, I hope the women in this body will think of the suffragettes who were extraordinarily active and involved in our community and making decisions in our families and in our communities and country, but who could not vote prior to 1919. 1789 to 1919. Women could not vote. I'm the father of 3 daughters, the grandfather of 2 granddaughters, and the great-grandfather of 3 great-granddaughters. For me to go home to them tonight and say, I voted against your being equal in America. Now, my wife passed away, but if I went home to her tonight and said, I voted against your being equal in America, or those grandchildren and great-grandchildren who happen to have been born as women, and say to them, I voted against your being equal in America today. We passed the Civil Rights Act to make clear that all must be treated equal regardless of race. We passed the ADA, which I co-sponsored 30 years ago, to ban discrimination against those with disabilities. But still, nowhere in our Constitution does it state clearly that women must be treated equally and that one must not be subject to discrimination because of their gender. The ERA would enshrine that basic tenet of our democracy in our Constitution at long last. 70% of the states, and then 3 more, said that ought to be our Constitution. 3/4 of the states have voted to ratify this amendment. Discrimination against women has, through our history, kept bright and talented Americans from achieving their full potential in our economy. Because of their hard work, the sacrifices, the leadership, and the perseverance of trailblazing women, we've seen barriers come down, doors of opportunity open, and glass ceilings shatter. But discrimination, inequality, and injustice persist, and we will hear arguments on this floor rationalizing why discrimination ought to still exist. And as long as our Constitution does not explicitly ban discrimination based upon gender, as it does based on race, we will continue to see forms of legal discrimination against women linger in our country. Taking this step to add the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution is one of the many that House Democrats are taking to combat discrimination against women, simply because they are women. Last year, we passed the Paycheck Fairness Act. Not everybody voted for that, but in my opinion, everybody voted for that who thought equal pay should mean equal pay irrespective of gender and based upon work performed. That built on the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 to ensure that equal pay for equal work. We also passed the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Most of us on our side voted for that. But there was a rationalization why some thought, no, we will not protect women against violence. We've continued working to protect women's rights to make their own health care choices and to access quality, affordable care. Who said that was part of the Constitution? The Supreme Court of the United States. They said that was a constitutional right. And we see effort after effort after effort to erode that constitutional right. I'm proud that the Democratic caucus in the 116th Congress is not only the most diverse in American history, but also includes the greatest number of women. In Virginia, it was an election that saw the House of Delegates reach 30% women, and the state Senate reached 28%. And once it got there, the women of Virginia stood up and said this ought to be in the Constitution of the United States, and they voted to do so. Virginia now has a woman as Speaker of the House as we do in our U.S. House, and as my home state of Maryland has in our House of Delegates. It is because more women are stepping up to run for office and winning election that more women's voices are being heard in our democracy. That is why this resolution is on the floor. That's a wonderful thing, and I've been proud to help recruit talented women to run for the House as Democrats. And very frankly, we need more women as Republicans, a diminishing group, I might add. I urge my colleagues, men and women, Democrats and Republicans, to join in supporting this resolution. And finally, is it too late? It is too late, but it is never too late to do the right thing. Make this part of our Constitution. Stand up and say, yes, women should be included as all humankind who are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That is the principle that we are articulating today. Alice Paul, who first wrote the ERA and campaigned for it for most of her life, was once asked why she kept all her focus on getting the job done. And she said this, quote, when you put your hand to the plow, you can't put it down till you get to the end of the row. We're not at the end of the row, but this is a way upon that row to make it complete, to make our Constitution protect all people, male or female, black or white, all people. At long last, let's hold firm to that plow. Let's get the job done. Vote yes on this resolution.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I rise today to commend the women who have gone before us, to celebrate the achievements that women have made, and to reaffirm the fact that we are equal in the eyes of God and in law. Women make up 51% of the population, comprise over half of the college students, make up most of today's medical and law school students, and own the majority of new businesses. Women are not victims in need of validation. Little girls can be whatever they want to be, whether that be an astronaut, a doctor, a full-time mom working at home, or a member of Congress. In addition, federal law and court precedent uphold our rights. That is something to applaud, and I do. However, today's legislation is problematic on several fronts. First, the resolution is unconstitutional. The time limit to pass the ERA expired decades ago. Congress can't go back and remove a deadline from a previous constitutional amendment initiative. The Supreme Court has recognized the 1972 ERA expired, and the Department of Justice issued a ruling saying Congress may not revive a proposed amendment after a deadline for its ratification has expired. Pretending that we can remove the time limits for passage is both futile and deceptive. Secondly, if the time limit could be extended, the ERA would not bring women any more rights than they currently have right now, but it would entrench the legality of abortion. We know this from court precedent by listening to those who have the most to gain from constitutionally protecting abortion on demand. In 1998, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that the Equal Rights Amendment in their state constitution requires state funding of abortions. Federal courts are likely to do the same. Perhaps that's why every pro-abortion organization is endorsing passage of the ERA. NARAL Pro-Choice America says, with its ratification, the ERA would reinforce the constitutional right to abortion. National Organization for Women says an ERA properly interpreted could negate the hundreds of laws that have passed restricting access to abortion. But that's not the only concern with passing this resolution. Besides being unconstitutional and shredding state and federal pro-life protections, the ERA would also erase decades of progress which have provided opportunities for women, advanced women's progress through federal programs, and secured necessary protections for women and girls. How? By incorporating gender identity in the definition of sex, jeopardizing private spaces for women, girls' sports programs, and women's educational institutions. The ERA endangers laws, programs, and funding designed to benefit women, providing a pathway for legal challenges to welfare programs, grants for battered women's shelters, efforts to bolster women participating in STEM programs, as well as state laws governing child support, alimony, and custody. These outcomes are anything but pro-women. I urge my colleagues to vote no and yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of Res 79, which takes a step to assure that the Equal Rights Amendment will become part of our Constitution. Nearly 100 years after women gained the right to vote, it's difficult to believe we still haven't given women equal rights. It's hard to believe it's serious disagreement in this chamber. In the year 2020, it's unacceptable that women still make only 80 cents for every dollar earned by men, and that women are still subject to violence, harassment, and attacks on their freedom to control their own bodies. In Judiciary Committee this morning, a brilliant female law clerk is describing sexual harassment by a distinguished and respected Ninth Circuit judge. This should never happen. And with ongoing efforts to undermine progress we've made, the Equal Rights Amendment is more important than ever. It took over 130 years to give women the right to vote. It's almost 100 years since they've got it. It's time to give women their proper place in the Constitution of the United States, which most modern constitutions have, equality regardless of sex. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Walorski.
Gentlewoman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in opposition to Res 79, and of course I believe in equal rights. Women should never face discrimination and harassment. I believe we should be empowering women and girls to achieve their dreams. So it's disappointing today to stand in this chamber and see this important issue turned into some type of political stunt. The deadline for states to ratify the ERA passed nearly 4 decades ago. Even Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has stated the only path forward is to start over. So let's be honest. This is not about equality or women's rights. This is about enshrining unrestricted abortion in the Constitution and allowing full taxpayer funding for abortion. Now is not the time to be weakening pro-life protections. Yesterday in South Bend, Indiana, in my district, the remains of 2,411 victims of abortion were finally given a dignified burial. After spending 20 years in moldy styrofoam boxes in the back of the doctor, abortionist himself, in the back of his car and in his basement. These unborn boys and girls would be young men and women today entering college. Moments ago, we stood on this House floor together, and we offered a moment of silence, that these innocent lives were taken, and there were victims, over 2,400. I would ask that together we stand again to defend the rights of the most vulnerable among us, that we stand together today for the sanctity of life, to lift women up, to protect women, and to strengthen families. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting against this misguided resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, with Virginia becoming the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, today we make it clear that Congress never intended the arbitrary deadline to act as a barrier to ratification of this vital amendment. Ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment affirms our nation's values by codifying an express prohibition against sex discrimination in our nation's foundational document. While our nation's courts have properly recognized that women are entitled to equal protection under the law, we have a responsibility to do all that we can to guarantee that regardless of sex, all Americans are treated the same in every aspect of their lives, including making a living, obtaining health care, and accessing public services. These rights must not be swayed by political ideology or depend on judicial philosophy. Equality is a founding value of this great country, and more than any other word describes the very idea of America. A vote for House Resolution 79 is a vote for equality. I urge my colleagues to support Res 79, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Hang on, okay. Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution. Listening to people on the other side say that there is a cornucopia of benefits awaiting women should the ERA become a part of the Constitution. I'm here to ask members on both sides of the aisle to look past what looks nice on a bumper sticker or a 40-second soundbite, to realize that there are going to be many consequences that will hurt women should this be ratified. I'll just talk about insurance, because insurance is regulated by the states. Girls get substantially lower rates on auto insurance because they're better drivers. With the ERA and the state regulation, that would become unconstitutional, and girls are going to have to pay boy drivers' rates for auto insurance, which really does not reflect the actuarial exposure of that at all. Secondly, look at life insurance. Women live longer than men. And as a result, in life insurance, also regulated by the states, you see women's rates being lower than men's rates, becoming unconstitutional. And women are going to be paying more to life insurance companies for the coverage that they desire. I could go on and on and on. We had a lot of hearings on this in 1973. I'm here to say that when the ERA was originally passed in 1972, women's rights were not enshrined in a lot of state laws. There's been tremendous progress in this area, both at the federal level and in the states. The proponents of this resolution completely ignore that happening. We don't. And we think that the statutory protections that have been passed all around the country in the last almost 50 years have advanced women and have addressed a lot of the complaints that we hear from that side of the aisle. This is going to unleash Pandora's box of lots of litigation that have been raised by this, some of which have been brought up by my colleagues on this side. Let's not enrich the lawyers.
Time has expired.
Let's do the right thing.
Gentleman's
Don't pass this resolution and enforce the laws that have been passed both here and in the state
Gentleman's
capitals.
time has expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Representative Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank all of the women of America. I thank the sponsor of this bill. I thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and the ranking member for being on the floor. Thank him. I ask the question, does anybody see the sense of women not being in the most powerful document of laws and power of the American people? Let us be reminded of the words of Abigail Adams. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, what she's saying to her husband, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make a desire, I would desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. I rise enthusiastically to support H.J. Res. 79 and to say to my colleagues, there is no constitutional prohibition for passing this. We are grandly involved because this is a 1972 passage by the state of Texas of the Equal Rights Amendment. And here, 1977, Betty Friedan and Bella Abzug in Houston at the 1977 National Women's Conference,
Gentlewoman's time has
Barbara Jordan was at. Let us pass H.J. Res because Abigail Adams said, let's remember the ladies. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, we've heard my Democratic colleagues say that passing the Equal Rights Amendment is necessary to secure basic rights under the law for women. Not only is this untrue, it obscures a fundamental fact. This ERA actually denies the most basic human right, the right to life. This ERA uses gender equality as a smokescreen to create an unlimited constitutional right to abortion. Instead of working to craft legislation that protects women's rights without trampling on the right to life, Democrats have put forward today an unconstitutional partisan measure. Not only would this result in on-demand abortions across all 50 states, but also clear the way to provide taxpayer-funded abortions throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, costing millions of dollars every year. This measure is not about advancing women's rights, especially as women across the country, Republicans and Democrats alike, are increasingly horrified by the practice of late-term abortion and by recent comments made in New York and Virginia that life-saving treatments should be denied to some newborns. Allowing women to discard their unborn children at taxpayer expense is not ensuring gender equality. It is not protecting women. It is not empowering women. It is not providing women equal pay for equal work. It's simply another step down the path of devaluing all human life and dignity. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no on this measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Nadler. In Texas, many years ago, I marched in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. Today, I join my colleagues to reaffirm that support. Women are behind some of this nation's greatest achievements. We fought for civil rights, set athletic records, sent men to space, and then went there ourselves. We have forged our paths in history, yet we're still not equal to men under the eyes of the law. We must remove this stain from our Constitution. Today, we're voting to remove an arbitrary deadline so we can finally prohibit gender discrimination under the Constitution. I will proudly vote in favor of the resolution and urge all my colleagues to do the same. And as many in my district would say, ya es hora de aprobar el ERA. It is time to approve the ERA. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This time I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentlewoman from West Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to oppose House Joint Resolution 79. It pains me to say that life is under attack in our nation. The pro-abortion discussions taking place around this country are sickening. In the last year, we heard a governor promote infanticide, and we saw state legislatures take action for the same. We still haven't had a vote on this floor in the United States House of Representatives to protect babies that survive abortion. Yesterday in committee, I even introduced legislation that would protect babies who survive abortion. It failed along party lines once again. We have millions of American families who would love to adopt, yet we don't discuss that. I know women who have cried every month when they realized that they had not conceived the baby they so desperately wanted. I know men and women who have undergone multiple tests and procedures just to conceive a child. They would gladly adopt a baby that someone else didn't want. Instead, today we are voting once more on another piece of legislation that would drastically reduce protections for life. This bill would create the basis for taxpayer-funded abortion at the federal level, and it would permanently allow abortion until birth for any reason throughout the nation. It would force government-funded health care providers and hospitals to provide abortions. We cannot have that. We cannot bring abortion into health care in that debate because it's not health care. Abortion is murder. If we want to discuss protecting rights for all Americans, it needs to pertain to everyone, including and especially newborns. And while I always welcome a conversation with my colleagues about how we can advance women's rights and the rights of all people, this is not the way to do it. It is not through thinly veiled messaging bills with nice names but radical policies. We can pass good pro-woman, pro-family, pro-American legislation through bipartisan solutions. So if we're going to do it, let's do it. But today, sadly, we won't, and that is so disappointing. I yield back my time.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the chairman for his leadership. I rise today in strong support of the Equal Rights Amendment and the resolution before us. Today, this body comes together unabashed in our conviction for a future that expands the vision set forth by our founders. Together, we strive for a nation that advances the notion of equality, that takes up the mantle of the unfinished work that is the American dream and the practice of government by and for the people, for all the people. My daughter, Natalie, is just over a year and a half old, and I look forward to telling her one day about today, how the People's House, led by the Chamber's first female speaker, voted to ensure that the women of her generation will be the first to grow up knowing that the Constitution truly guarantees equal rights. It feels fitting to close by quoting Shirley Chisholm, the first black female member elected to this body, and the youngest until my good friend Lauren Underwood took office last year, who said that when Congress sent the ERA to the states for ratification, the time is clearly now to put this House on record for the fullest expectation of that equality of opportunity which our founding fathers professed. It is not too late to complete the work they left undone.
Time has expired.
I support the resolution, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Georgia for yielding time. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.J. Res. 79. As a woman who has worked all her life, often in male-dominated professions, I detest discrimination in any form against any group, and I've always done all that I can to eliminate it. Furthermore, I welcome any discussion on how to root out discrimination against women where it exists. But do not be deceived. This is not what this legislation is about. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution already provides women and all Americans equal protection under the law. But the goal of this legislation is different. The goal here is to expand access to abortion up to birth and to overturn the broadly supported policies that protect taxpayers from being forced to pay for abortions. As we know all too well, Roe v. Wade has broadly legalized abortion in the United States, but the Equal Rights Amendment that this resolution tries to ratify goes much further. There's broad consensus that the ERA could be used to overturn pro-life laws, legalize abortion up to birth, and mandate taxpayer-funded abortions. The expansion of abortion is not the only harmful impact of the ERA. It would have a harmful impact on shelters that protect women from violence, eliminate women's specific workplace protections, and destroy women's sports. Furthermore, were this resolution ever to become law, the Supreme Court would undoubtedly rule that it does not ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. As everyone in this room knows, when Congress initially passed the Equal Rights Amendment, it intentionally included a 7-year deadline for the required 38 states to ratify, a deadline which has long since passed. Multiple states have also rescinded their ratification. As such, Supreme Court precedent requires that any attempt to ratify the ERA must start at the beginning. Even Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was recently quoted saying she would like the process to start over. To be perfectly clear, with this resolution, the Democrats are attempting to write into the Constitution the right to an abortion in all 3 trimesters, force taxpayers to pay for them, and eliminate all conscience protections for medical providers who wish to abstain from abortion. This resolution is not about protecting women. It's a partisan messaging bill designed to appease radical pro-abortion groups. If the majority were serious about the Equal Rights Amendment, it would start the process anew and give all states the option to consider the ERA again. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York is
Speaker,
recognized.
I would remind everyone that the Equal Rights Amendment simply says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on account of sex. If people on the other side want to admit that equality of rights under the law means there must be a constitutional right to abortion, well, that's wonderful. Of course, the constitutional right to abortion is already established under current law. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Representative Jayapal.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What a glorious day this is. Today, the House of Representatives will vote to remove the arbitrary deadline to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And with our vote today, and with Virginia's historic vote to become the 38th and final state necessary to ratify the amendment, little girls, their moms, and women across this great nation will know that, yes, our Constitution can, will, and must enshrine a ban on discrimination on the basis of sex. Equality of sexes is not debatable. It has no expiration date. First proposed almost a century ago and passed by Congress in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment would be a momentous step forward for women to end unequal pay, pregnancy discrimination, and sexual harassment and exploitation. So today, to women across this country who are watching, let me say, and I say this as the first South Asian American woman ever elected to the House of Representatives, we see you, we stand with you, and we will fight for you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Georgia, Representative McBath.
The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Women have been fighting tooth and nail for decades to be recognized as equal under the eyes of the law. While we made significant gains, it is time for full constitutional equality. In 1886, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a free-born black woman, addressed the National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. And she said, and I quote, "Justice is not fulfilled so long as a woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members." These words still hold true today. For our mothers, for our daughters, and for our future leaders, we must take up the mantle of the women who came before us and pass this amendment for a more just future. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Oh, yeah.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm so pleased that the gentlewoman from Virginia is in the chair and grateful to her for her leadership and our other colleagues, Elaine Loria and Abigail Spanberger, as new members of Congress who give us the opportunity as the majority to bring this important legislation to the floor, and thank them for Virginia's leadership in all of this. It's so appropriate that Congresswoman is in the chair for this, because she was a leader in the state legislature on the Equal Rights Amendment when she served there. This is an historic day, a happy day, as the House takes action to move our nation closer to our founding ideal that all are created equal. I salute Congresswoman Jackie Speer for her leadership on this resolution and for her lifetime of work to advance equality in America. She quoted the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia when she said, and I think it bears repetition, Justice Scalia said, "Certainly the Constitution does not require discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It does not." End of quote. It does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. The lack of an ERA has allowed the Supreme Court justice to have this interpretation. Here it is. We say it over and over again. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. How can you have a problem with that? How can you have a problem with that? Let me also salute Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney, our long-time lead sponsor of the Equal Rights Amendment in the House, for her great leadership, and to you, Chairman Nadler, the members of the Judiciary Committee, and all the members who came to Congress committed to finishing this fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. I also want to acknowledge that yesterday at our press presentation on this, in the audience was a Republican from Illinois who was responsible for Illinois passing the Equal Rights Amendment, Stephen Anderson. He was with us at the Capitol. We commend him for being a leader on the ERA, passing it through the Illinois State House. What an honor, and how clear that this is not partisan, perhaps only in the House of Representatives, but not in the rest of the country. And let us acknowledge the women, the millions of women in Nevada, Illinois, Virginia, and across America who have raised a drumbeat for ratification and reignited a nationwide movement for equality. Nearly 100 years ago, Alice Paul, a Republican, introduced the Equal Rights Amendment, the first proposed amendment to the Constitution calling for women's equality in America. 50 years ago, soon after becoming the first African-American woman to serve in the Congress, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm stood on this House floor during passage of the ERA, calling it, quote, one of the most clear-cut opportunities we are likely to have to declare our faith in the principles that shaped our Constitution, end of quote. But today, in this year that marks the centennial of women having the right to vote, it is a shameful reality that the Equal Rights Amendment still has not been enshrined in the Constitution. And as a result, millions of American women still face inequality under the law and injustice in their careers and lives. Without full equality under the Constitution, women face a devastating wage gap, and this has an impact not only on what families earn today, but on women's pension and retirement in the future. This is wrong. Women are faced discrimination as they raise families. 62% of pregnant women and new moms are in the workforce. But current law allows pregnant workers to be placed on unpaid leave or forced out of their jobs. And sexual harassment and assault too often go unchecked, all leading to women's underrepresentation at the decision-making table. Today, by passing, and we know what the statistics, 33 CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies are women. Really? Today, by passing this resolution, the House is paving the way to enshrining Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution. The era will achieve justice for women and achieve progress for families, for our children, lowering wage disparity, increasing paychecks so moms can pay for their families' needs, such as rent, groceries, child care, health care. And the ERA will strengthen America. It's not just about women, it's about America. The ERA will strengthen America, unleashing the full power of women in our economy and upholding the value of equality in our democracy. I have 4 daughters, 1 son, 2 granddaughters. I can't even imagine how anyone could think of his or her daughter not having equality, his or her sister, mom, wife, not having equality. What is that about? What is that about? Women should not have the same status of equality as men. This has nothing to do with the abortion issue. That's an excuse. It's not a reason. It has everything to do with the respect for women. Your daughter, your sister, your wife, your mother. And you're saying, by voting against this, that your daughter, your sister, your mother, your spouse should not have equal protection under the law in the Constitution of the United States. To those who say that the ERA is not necessary, let me quote from a recent statement from the American Association of University Women. It states, "Many Americans mistakenly believe that the U.S. Constitution explicitly guarantees equality between men and women. Perhaps you think that. The Equal Rights Amendment would, once and for all, guarantee constitutional equality between men and women. Its ratification would provide the constitutional guarantee that all men and women are truly equal under the law." I urge a strong bipartisan vote for this resolution. It will be bipartisan in the United States Senate when we send it over there shortly. And so to ensure that women are truly equal under the law in America. Because we know in America, when women succeed, America succeeds. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I request the time for both sides?
Gentleman has 11 minutes remaining.
And
the gentleman from New York has 15.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for bringing this resolution to a vote, and thank you to Representative Speer and Representative Maloney for your work on this legislation. This is an historic day. It has been nearly a century since the first constitutional amendment to guarantee equal treatment for women was introduced in 1923. Since then, 37 states have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, including my home state of Pennsylvania in 1972. Virginia's ratification of ERA this past January brought us one step closer to this basic right, that we will be held equal in the eyes of the Constitution. The motto of Susan B. Anthony's newspaper was, quote, "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less." And today we again say that women will accept nothing less than equality. ERA builds on the work of Anthony and others like Jeanette Rankin, Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells, and this diverse Congress. I have to tell you, I am filled with joy today because I'm looking forward to going home and telling my granddaughters, Aubrey and Ella, that we are one step closer to a more perfect union. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Representative Maloney.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Jackie Speer, for your historic leadership on the ERA. Madam Speaker, first introduced in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment is still as relevant and necessary as ever, because we know that equality for women will always elude us when it isn't etched into our Constitution. We've seen it when the Supreme Court gutted the Violence Against Women Act. We've seen it when judges don't enforce equal pay for equal work, or when a federal judge ruled that Congress didn't have the authority to outlaw female genital mutilation. But if your rights are in the Constitution, they can't be rolled back by changing whims of legislators, judges, or presidents. Women are long past due equal treatment under the law, and we will persist until it is firmly guaranteed. There is no deadline for equality. We demand our equality be spelled out in the Constitution, and we spell it E-R-A. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this important vote for equality, and I yield back.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Lawrence.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of H.J.R. 79, which removes the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. A woman's rights must be guaranteed by our government. This bill is about the members of Congress ensuring that the rights and equality for women are a part of our Constitution. It's sad to watch those who lose their way because they'll find any way to distract the issue of equality. The members on the other side are trying to interject abortion into this. But I want to say that even though we have come so far as women, a record number of women lawmakers here in this House, we have so far to go, and this corrects that injustice and recognizes equality for women under the law. As the great Shirley Chisholm stated, and I quote, she was the first African-American woman of Congress, "The time is clearly now to put this House on record for the fullest expression of that equality of opportunity which our founding fathers possessed. They possessed it, but they did not assure it. We try, as they tried to do for their sons." I encourage support of this bill. Thank you.
The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We're still reserved.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Virginia, Representative Wexton.
The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank Congresswoman Spear for introducing this important resolution. In 1923, Alice Paul introduced the Equal Rights Amendment to include women in our nation's founding document. Nearly 100 years later, during my time in the Virginia State Senate, I sponsored the resolution for Virginia to ratify the ERA. But it wouldn't be until January 27, 2020, with a historic number of women lawmakers serving in the state legislature, that the great Commonwealth of Virginia became the 38th and final state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This was not simply a symbolic vote. Specifically affirming equality on the basis of sex in the Constitution will strengthen state and federal laws that protect women. We need the ERA to ensure that equal justice under law is a constitutional right for women, not just an inscription over the entrance to the Supreme Court. Finally, these words will ring true. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Today, I am proud to cast my vote in support of the ERA and in recognition of the tireless work of so many trailblazers and activists over the years, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Underwood.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.J. Res. 79, a bipartisan bill that moves us closer to adopting the Equal Rights Amendment. Madam Speaker, American women are barrier breakers. We have broken down barriers and shattered glass ceilings in education, at work, in the law, in the military, and at home. We are in a new era when women are leading in ways that they never have before, but legal gender discrimination, pay disparities, and inequality remain. They will not go away on their own. That is why we need to ensure that women's rights are guaranteed by adopting the Equal Rights Amendment. I was so proud in 2018 when Illinois ratified the ERA at long last. 2 years later, I am here on the House floor because the women of Northern Illinois sent me here to fight for them. I am here to fight for our right as women to equal treatment under the Constitution of our great country. I urge all my colleagues to move us one giant step closer to legal equality by supporting this essential bill. And I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves.
Also.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
The gentlewoman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this resolution to remove the arbitrary deadline to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This year is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, yet women are still fighting for full and equal rights under the law. Women continue to face many barriers to true equality, including pregnancy and gender discrimination, unequal pay, and a lack of access to a full range of reproductive health care services. The Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution would provide for fundamental equality for women, regardless of who is president, who is on the Supreme Court, or changes in federal law. Congress first approved the ERA in 1972, and my home state of Oregon was quick to ratify it the following year. And now 38 states, the required 3/4 under the Constitution, have ratified the amendment. And today, Congress will stand with our states and make it clear that it is time, actually way past time, to adopt the Equal Rights Amendment. It's not too late to do the right thing. It's not too late for equality. I urge all of my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from the 38th state, Virginia, Representative Beyer.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's been 97 years since the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in the 68th Congress and 48 years since the ERA passed the House and Senate. And in those 48 years, I've had 3 daughters and 1 granddaughter. And those 4 young women are brilliant, precocious, accomplished, with strong character, great morality, and true nobility. And these women are every bit the equal of any man I've ever met. Yet our Constitution does not recognize their equality nor prohibit discrimination against them. I'm very proud that Commonwealth of Virginia was the 38th state to ratify the ERA. We must permanently remove the deadline for state ratification and provide an essential legal remedy against gender discrimination. Does this sound like a political stunt? Quote, women shall have equal rights in the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. No, these words belong in the United States Constitution. There's nothing partisan but recognizing men and women have equal rights under the law. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve.
reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Every single constitution in the whole world written since 1959, including Afghanistan, for example, has the equivalent of the Equal Rights Amendment, but the United States of America does not. Though my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and President Trump's Department of Justice may tell you otherwise, we need the Equal Rights Amendment, and we need it now. The requisite number of states have now voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Last year, my home state of Illinois was the 37th state to ratify, and this year, Virginia brought us to that number of 38. And today, I will proudly vote yes to show my grandchildren, my granddaughters, and my grandsons that women are not only strong and powerful and resilient, but also equal citizens under the law. I urge my colleagues to stand with us, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of House Joint Resolution 79 and stand shoulder to shoulder with women to demand gender equality and justice. When I think about the future of our country and what I want it to look like for young women and girls, like my granddaughter Anna, I envision a just and equitable society with fair play, diverse leadership, and equal access to basic health care rights. That is why the Equal Rights Amendment is necessary. For too long, our country's structural barriers have cast a shadow over women's rights. With 38 states having affirmed their support for the ERA, we are one step closer to shattering those barriers. This resolution negates misguided arguments that because of some arbitrary deadline, the Equal Rights Amendment is effectively dead. It's clear from the recent actions in Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, and our collective voices. It is still very much alive, and we will not rest until it is ingrained in the most sacred document of our nation's history. I urge my colleagues to stand with our country's women and support our right to constitutional equality. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, 244 years ago, women were left out of our Constitution by the men who drafted it. But since then, generations of women and men have blazed a steady trail towards equality in this country. But we still do not have constitutional equality. I attended many ERA events representing the League of Women Voters in the 1970s, and if someone would have told me then that we would still be fighting for this in 2020, I would have said it was a failure of justice. Why is anyone against rights for everyone? Equal rights for women transcend your politics, they transcend your age, where you're from, and your gender. Women in this country continue to receive unequal pay, suffer from harassment in the workplace, endure discrimination for pregnancies, and fight long legal battles over domestic violence cases. A correction of our Constitution is clearly long overdue. Liberty and justice for all must apply equally to women and men in this country.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Let's pass this resolution. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, 28 days ago, on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA. After decades of struggle, 48 years after congressional passage, 2/3 of states agreed to an amendment that secures equal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. This amendment will touch every corner of our lives. With 24 words, our nation will finally fully recognize women as equal participants in society. To my colleagues opposing the ERA, what are you afraid of? How can you oppose this resolution and then look women in your district, in your churches, in your own homes in the eye? Today is your chance to stand on the right side of her story. I implore my colleagues, vote yes on HJ Resolution 79. Let us finish this struggle, and at long last, women and men are finally equal under the law with the rights enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 45 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 45 seconds.
Since women gained the right to vote 100 years ago, we've made incredible progress, rolling back laws like those that kept us from serving on juries, owning land, or even getting our own credit card. And this Congress has more women than ever. But true equality is still a goal, not a reality. The fact is, women are still paid less than men for the same work, and we still have men passing laws that dictate our choices about our bodies. It's clear if we want equality, we need the ERA. And the people agree. We saw that at women's marches across the country and in the groundswell of the Me Too movement. And that energy is leading to change. The people are speaking. It's up to us to listen. Arbitrary deadlines are no reason to silence our voices. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and give women the same rights as men.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 45 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you very much. I thank the chairman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support today of Congresswoman Spear's H.J. Res. 79. I have to thank Congresswoman Spear and Congresswoman Maloney for their consistent leadership as warrior women. The ERA would guarantee rights to all and would finally affirm women's equality in our Constitution by removing this arbitrary deadline. And we know that too often women have been relegated to the sidelines and left out of the Constitution, especially black women and women of color. For example, there's still rampant gendered wage discrimination. Discrimination against women must end. That's why the ERA is so important. It would make sure that our government would ensure that women are treated equally, a right that needs to be clearly outlined in every aspect of our country. I want my granddaughters, Jordan, Simone, and Giselle, to know that they are equal to men and that their rights are enshrined in the Constitution. They, like every girl and woman, deserve equality in their country. They should know that their country, the United States of America, has finally joined the rest of the world to stand up for their rights as American women.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 45 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Hawaii, Representative Case.
The gentleman from Hawaii is recognized for 45 seconds.
Madam Speaker, I rise in very strong support of this resolution to advance the cause of full and equal rights for all women. I do so for my one-year-old granddaughter, for whom I deeply hope that when she reaches the age of understanding, the ERA will be as enshrined in our Constitution as is the right to vote today. I also do so as a proud citizen of Hawaii. On March 22, 1972, when the U.S. Senate sent the ERA to the states, it was early in the morning in Hawaii. But by shortly afternoon that same day, our legislature voted for ratification, the first state to do so. For my country and Hawaii and for all of our women leaders who led this fight, past and present, I proudly join my colleagues in voting for the ERA.
From New York, reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 45 seconds to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After nearly a century, the Equal Rights Amendment is on the cusp of ratification. At America's founding, women were intentionally left out of the Constitution. As second-class citizens, we lack the right to vote, hold most jobs, or even own property. Today, we still receive less pay for the same work, and we face violence and harassment just for being a woman. But the ERA will prohibit all of that. In the eyes of our most sacred document, we will finally be equal. Women's rights should not depend on congressional whims or who occupies the White House. These basic fundamental rights must be guaranteed. But if we want to hand a more perfect union over to our daughters, and I have 2 of them, we must seize this moment to end sex discrimination. We owe it to the women who sacrificed before us and all of our daughters and sons who deserve a life of true equality. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution to remove the arbitrary and outdated deadline for ratifying the ERA. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. 1 minute left.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just confirming the chairman, we are ready to close. Is that correct? Okay, good. Madam Speaker, before I begin my close, I yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin for parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Speaker, parliamentary inquiry. It is my intention to raise point of order that this resolution requires a 2/3 vote. I will argue the point of order when it is made, but I need to know when the proper time is to raise the point of order.
The proper time would be when the chair puts the question on passage.
Before or after it is passed?
Before.
Before. At the time the chair puts the question.
Okay, I thank the chair.
Thank you. And now I'm ready to close.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It has been interesting, the discussion on the floor today. It's been interesting on both sides to hear the different aspects of why this bill is on the floor, why we're doing it, why we shouldn't be doing it, and many things. It's been interesting, the discussion, if you go from a strictly number of states category. What's been interesting is my colleagues across the aisle have talked about that there are now 38 states, but they failed to mention 5 states who rescinded their votes. 5 states would put you under 38. What is interesting to me in the Rules Committee the other night, the argument was that if they rescinded, it's not valid to rescind, but yet you can add states after the time limit is up. That's an interesting argument to make if you're actually looking at it from the perspective of if they rescinded within the time frame, but yet passed it after the time frame, that's okay. Then I actually heard one of my colleagues actually mention the fact that if we passed it in here today, that this would now become part of the process and along with the state of Virginia ratifying it, is now part of our Constitution. I'm sure this was just a euphoric discussion about how this would actually go about, but they was also forgetting the Senate is involved in this. It's amazing as we take down. I was really worried at one point, and I turned to on the discussion that there was it was said on multiple occasions that there was no protection in the Constitution for women. I was almost scared for a moment that the 14th Amendment had been repealed and I didn't know it. It is in there and still in there. Checked just a few minutes ago, it's safe. It is interesting to determine when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the foremost architects in looking at this bill, even in the 70s coming forward, has said, if you want to do this, start over. Do it the proper way. As my chairman has said earlier, basically, a deadline should not get in the way of what we want. A deadline should not get in the way of what I want to have happen. That's becoming more and more of a concern in this body, that the rules and parliamentary procedures don't matter if it interferes with what we want. But at the end of the day, the question really becomes is why are we doing this? Why are we bringing this forth when there is absolutely no legal precedent, no constitutional precedent, no anything out there, and including some of the founders who actually started this whole process 40 plus years ago, who say this is not the way you do it. And the reason I know that is a concern is because some of those who've actually said this have been criticized in the media from the perspective of supporters of the ERA to say they have now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's comments have now killed the ERA or effectively done it. The reason is because she's speaking the truth about this issue. We disagree on most everything from a legal perspective, but on this one we happen to agree, and she's laid forth clearly what should happen here. But let me also say, and it's been talked about a great deal, so I think we just need to come to the real scenario on why this is happening. Not that we believe it'll actually happen for anybody here that believes that today is actually going to put it in part of the Constitution. That's not going to happen. So what is it? It's a political nod to the understanding of those who are speaking for this. As we have heard earlier, NARAL, Pro-Choice America, with ratification of the ERA, reinforced the constitutional right to abortion by clarifying sexes have equal rights, which would require judges to strike down anti-abortion laws. Also, NARAL, the ERA will support protecting women's right to abortion. With 5 anti-choice justices on the Supreme Court and Roe Wade on the chopping block is more important than ever. We codify women's bodily autonomy in our lives. Co-director of Reproduction, abortion restrictions amount to sex discrimination because they single out people for unfair treatment basis of sex. The Senior Counsel, National Women's Law Center, the ERA would help create a basis for challenging abortion restrictions. This is what this is actually about. This is what the basis is needed because there has been a shifting in this country to understand that, in our opinion, in many opinion, that abortion is simply murder in the womb. It is not about life. It's interesting we're talking about the rights of women today, which again, this bill doesn't have anything to do with, but we're not concerned if the young women in the womb are even able to have a birthday. That's not concerned. So what would happen from these folks who are supporting your resolution today? Why do they want it? Because it gives a claim to start to finish unfettered abortion. So what does that mean? That means let's bring back partial birth abortion, in which if I have to remind anybody here, That means the delivery of the child all the way to the moment the chin comes almost out and then actually crushing their skull. That's what that is. If that's a right we're protecting, I don't want any part of it. And neither does most Americans. They don't want a part of it. But that's one of those restrictions that will be laid back. It would also continue to allow unlimited abortions at any stage for any reason, including sex selection. It's interesting that we would talk about this today, the ERA, and use this, but yet a family could choose to abort a child because it's a male or a female. Let's be honest about this. But the bottom line for me, what really bothers me the most about when it's unlimited, unfettered access to abortion that this bill opens up, if it was to have passed, was one that hits close to home for me. You see, a European country recently stated that geneticists in Iceland said we've almost basically eradicated Down syndrome people. And I thought to myself for a second, that would be great. I mean, if we could actually remove Down syndrome and help those and cure that, that would be an amazing medical discovery for all people. Except there's one portion. You know how they've done it? Through genetic testing and killing the children in the womb. They don't even let them have a birthday. One Icelandic counselor counsels mothers as follows. This is your life. You have the right to choose how your life will look. She says, we don't look at abortion as murder. We look at it as a thing that we ended. You want to know why this is opened up, America? This is why. And for those of us like myself who have a disabled child, I do not want to hear that we're protecting disabled rights and other rights when we're not even allowing them to be born in certain arenas. Every day, I get a text on this phone. It's from my daughter. Jordan is 27 years old. She has spina bifida. She cannot walk and has never took a step. And I believe, probably given a medical condition, it will not happen this side of heaven. But she rolls and she smiles. She goes to work 3 days a week. She gets herself up early to put her clothes on and take her shower and get a bus that she calls and she goes to work. The folks in Sweden, you know what they want to do? Kill her. Because she is not as valuable as a Down syndrome child is not as valuable. You want to open this Pandora's box of no abortion restrictions, then own what you're doing. But when Jordan texts me, she texts me, good morning, Daddy, I love you. How's your day? 27 years ago, when we found out a week ago, 27 years ago, that Jordan was going to have spina bifida. We were a young couple, just happy that God gave us a child. And to find out that she had a disability only kept our hearts more in tune to what God had given. But my wife went to school the next week, and so she was telling the teacher about what was going on, and she said, we're trying to figure out where we need to go to have Jordan helped when she's born and get some more medical attention. And this person looked at her and said, you know you have choices, correct? And my wife said, well, yes, there's Northside Hospital, there's Scottish Rite. She said, no, dear. You don't have to go through with this. That's your choice. In other words, as my wife looked at her and said, you're talking about my baby. You see, when we go down this path, don't flower this bill up. Look at the ones who actually talk about it and say this is an open door to abortion on demand with no restrictions, no government interference. In fact, government pay for it. But before you do that, America, as we look around, I want you to think of the picture on the new Gerber baby ad of the young person with Down syndrome who is now the face of Gerber baby food. If he was in Iceland, he would have been one of those that, as it said, oh, we ended. Think about my daughter, who when we allow it out there for people who are struggling, and to get news that you have a child with disability, that is one of the most amazingly devastating things that you can hear, because you don't know what the future holds. But what you do know is life is a gift from God, and that it is my joy to take care of her. We had 30 major surgeries before she was 5 years old, 3 of which were 9 hours in length. Tell me her life doesn't matter. For someone who doesn't have the possibility of understanding it, and they're given a choice because they have a disability, and somebody tells them and gets to them and says, don't worry, disabilities are bad, just go ahead and end that life and go on with your life. This is what this opens up. So don't give me a bill that's going nowhere for the reasons that it's been given. The true reasons are found in your own supporters. The true reasons are found in what we know to be true. When you understand what this is about, then I will stand till I have no more breath in my body for the right of those who can't speak for themselves. It is amazing to me that it was said that what would I be saying to my daughter if I voted against this? I'd be saying to Jordan, as I will, Jordan, the 14th Amendment's still there. Protections in law are still there. And by the way, restrictions on abortion will not be done away with. And your life matters. So if you want a picture of this, picture Jordan. And I yield back.
Expired. The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, once again, if Congress can enact a resolution putting a time limit, it can enact a resolution removing the time limit. And when the Senate passes this resolution, the ERA will be part of the Constitution. I now yield the balance of our time to represent the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Tlaib.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you so much. I rise very proudly, the first Muslim woman ever elected in Congress, in support of House Joint Resolution 79. I swear, what's even more interesting is what I've been hearing about is this obsession to control and oppress women in the United States of America. And I cannot believe it's 2020, we're still debating the merits of Equal Rights Amendment. It's beyond time. I want you all to know this is about women of color, women with disabilities, transgender women, immigrant women, all these women are affected by issues like unequal pay, sexual violence, lack of access for health care, and poverty. So much of what we're doing here in trying to promote women's equality is about gender, racial, and economic justice. So I would ask you all, know this, a no vote today is condoning oppression of women in the United States of America, and I urge support and yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. All time for debate has expired. On this vote, the yeas are 232, the nays are 183. The joint resolution is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Democratic presidential candidates are moving their campaigns across the country now that the first-in-the-nation primary and caucus are over. And this evening,